So as Varun mentioned earlier, I'll be talking about a tool that we built here at Indeed called Beholder. This was a system that we built that fits into one of our deployment processes. To start explaining a little bit of a background, my name is Sean Chambers, and I'm an engineering manager on what's called the money teams at Indeed. So the money teams here are in charge of collecting payment methods, performing authorizations of our employers' payment method and information, as well as calculating spend and metering of our clients, and then generating invoices and charging those invoices, and then recording all that information in our financial systems downstream at various times throughout the month. So in order to explain the reason that we built Beholder, it's important to get a good background first on why we needed this tool. J-SOX stands for Japanese Sarbanes-Oxley, and this is adapted from SOX processes, if you've heard of that. This is a Japanese version that deals with financial and accounting practices. There's a couple different portions of J-SOX. The main one that we're concerned with as money teams is the first one, which is system development and change management. And this mainly deals with creating software, writing code, deploying this code into various environments. The second one is security management that deals with hardware and software intrusion detection systems, things like that, to make sure none of the financial systems have been broken into. And then the last one is operational management, which is for like IT compliance. So IT compliance teams in Indeed will work with other various teams to make sure that they are in compliance with J-SOX processes. Being on money teams, they have the most exposure to IT compliance because we are moving the money from one place to another. So there's a lot of focus on that. The two portions of system development and change management that money teams and all software development teams in Indeed are concerned with that are in scope for J-SOX is segregation of duties and deployment verification. Segregation of duties deals with the various different roles that we have, and that each of these roles are separated from each other. So a good example of this is if a software developer makes a change to code, he is not allowed, according to J-SOX rules, to take that code, package it into a release, sign off on his own code review, deploy that into the production environment. Segregation of duties states that each step in the process has to be performed by a different actor. And it needs to be documented who these actors are to ensure that no one person is slipping in something malicious. The second portion, which is deployment verification, this is a process of validating all of the code commits that go into the various releases and ensuring that what we think is in that release is indeed in that release. This happens at the point in which we're deploying into a production environment, and it's also when, during end-of-month processes, all the engineering managers on teams that are in scope for J-SOX, myself would be one of them. Varun used to be on a team that was in scope for this. We have to perform an end-of-month check independent of the software team and the QA staff and everybody, and look at all the deploys and validate and approve those and say all of these changes and deploys were approved, segregation of duties was maintained, and things like that. So Beholder fits into this process right in the deployment verification phase. So to get a better view of how this fits into this process, it might be useful to talk first about how we did this before Beholder was present and we were using it. The first step in the process is once a developer completes a code review or completes a code change, they would open a code review and send this out to the team and include the team on the code review, or if it impacts multiple teams, include multiple teams. Once the code review has been completed, it then moves on to a stage that says, okay, this code review has been closed, it's been approved, so it can now be packaged into a release candidate and moved into a QA environment. At that point, QA staff will validate the features in the release and say, okay, this does what it's supposed to do, it looks good, it passes all the test cases. At this point in the process, before we had Beholder, QA would perform a manual validation that all of the code commits in this release are covered by a code review beforehand. And this code review is closed, it's been approved by somebody other than the person making the changes, and then that release candidate would be deployed to the production environment. So the manual step in the process here, which was when the QA staff validates that this contains all of the necessary releases, in certain cases there would be a missed code commit that the QA staff wouldn't necessarily know that this was contained in there, so we would catch this during end-of-month audits. So myself being the engineering manager would notice this deploy also has this additional ticket, this additional change that wasn't covered in this code review, so we would have to document that. We would have to take note of it and say this release also contained this additional item, and I discussed it with the QA staff and I discussed it with the developers, and it's okay to be in this release. So at this point, this is where Beholder comes into the process. So Beholder, it's a fairly simple tool. It's a code review auditing tool and a code commit verification tool. It fits, instead of the manual process, Beholder fits into the stage that normally would have occurred during a manual QA validation. So prior in our build pipeline, and like the Jenkins server, when this deployment is about to be deployed to production, Beholder will be, a request will be sent to Beholder and say, hey, I have this release. Can you please check and see if this release has a code review, and that code review is approved and the code review has been closed. If this rule, along with a couple other rules, has not been met, then the Beholder will automatically block the deploy from proceeding any further. So this had a couple of benefits because the manual step of verification was removed. QA staff no longer needed to validate that this was covered by these code commits, and it was covered by a code review, and the code review is closed out. So it freed them from doing that part of the process. In addition, if it did block a deploy, it moved that end-of-month discussion that all the engineering managers would have to have prior to the production deployment, so that we can look at this and, oh, hey, there's an additional commit here that we may have missed in the code review. Let's send that back to the developers real quick, get sign off, close it out, and now attempt another deploy and see if it goes through. So to look at this at a high level, there's also another process here that I'll speak to, is the process I just described is the validation phase. So we have an integration here where our deployment server would communicate with an API that Beholder exposes, and it would send along a couple pieces of information. The main piece of information is what release candidate is attempting to be deployed, at which point Beholder will integrate with GitLab and Upsource to say, hey, is this good, or is this closed out? Has it been approved? Is it approved by more than one person that's not the developer? If that fails, then it would block the deploy and return a false from that API call. The other portion of this that the team that built Beholder also put in is we realize that in some instances we may have like a deadlock scenario. Maybe we can't approve that code commit for one reason or another. So in addition, there was also a command line interface to Beholder that we can make manual override requests to say, look, we know we're trying to deploy this release and we know it's not all covered by a code review, so we want to override that. As part of that process, though, it will open a JIRA ticket and it will dispatch emails to IT compliance teams to say, hey, this audit override has been created. You have to review this with the team, so all parties are aware. So the reason that it was chosen to do this and build it ourselves was mainly it fit a very, very specific step in our deployment process. The engineering capabilities team that built it had the available bandwidth to build this tool for us and mainly work with money teams, as we're one of the largest consumers of this tool. And a lot of other market tools that fit this need were more broad in scope than simply just validating deployments for us to remove this manual step in the process that we had. So a really high-level swag of how much time we saved from this. Before we used Beholder and there was this manual steps in the process, it, on average, took about a week, a year of somebody's time to do these conversations, these manual validations. And afterwards, this was cut down to less than a day per year. And at a high level, that was it. If anybody had any questions or anything.